Welcome to the third and final panel of this year's strategy conference. We will have a final speaker at the end. This panel is one that I've been particularly looking forward to, both because of the topic and because of the star quality of the panelists that we have. What we're going to look at now is the ethics and professionalism for future strategic leaders, including questions like, what will the professional military ethos and ethic of 2030 be? What will civil military relations be like in 2030? Will there be continuity, adaptation, or pathology? The panel includes Major General retired Professor Charles Dunlap of Duke University, Dr. Pauline Shanks Kaurin, who's finishing a long stint at Pacific Lutheran University, and this summer will become the Admiral James B. Stockdale Professor of Military Ethics at the Naval War College, and my SSI colleague, Tony Pfaff, who, in addition to being a specialist on the military profession and ethic, has recently rejoined SSI after a stint on the National Security Council. As with the other panels, I've asked the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes just to kind of set the tone, to point us in a given direction, and then we'll begin a dialogue with the audience here, and again with the virtual audience. I refer you to the Twitter hashtags and the email addresses to get questions to us. So General Dunlap, if you'll lead us off.
Steve, thank you very much for organizing this conference. This is really, for many years, the strategy conference is the place to go to find out not just what's the Army's thinking about, but really national security writ large. And that's why it really is an honor and privilege to be here. And I certainly want to say thanks to my escort, Ken Cager, who's done a terrific job. And I thoroughly enjoyed sitting in on the seminar because being down at Duke, there's lots of wonderful things down there. We weren't so happy about the basketball season, but it's, you know, you're really in the civilian community there, and it's hard to find anybody to speak your language, so to speak. And I will tell you one story that how important it is to understand language. I appreciate we had some international students here, but one of the places when I was on active duty that I enjoyed the most was South Africa. And those of you who were at the dinner or the reception earlier know that I like to be a good guest to sample the local libations. And so the South African's wonderful place for wine. I picked up this wine bottle. I was sampling all the wines, and it was entirely in Afrikaans, and it's one of the 12 official languages. Unfortunately, it's one of the million languages that I don't understand. So all the South Africans are kind of looking at me. I poured a little glass, and I took a sip, and to be perfectly honest with you, no offense to any South Africans that might be here, but it was awful. It was terrible. And I kept drinking it, you know, to be a good guest. And finally, one of the wives of the South African officers, she leans over to me and she says, "Sir, you do know you're drinking the salad dressing, right?" I said, "Of course I do. We Americans love that, you know." The scary part is that's actually a true story. Anyway, what I wanted to, I'm only going to be brief because I really want to get to the questions. The Q&A in this subject is really probably the most important thing. I think that in 2030, which interestingly enough, in a military career, 12 years is a long time. But in the great scheme of things, it's really a snapshot. So it's really not so far in the distant future. In my view, we'll see some continuity adaptation and some pathology. But I want to be a little bit of contrarian in that I don't think that we'll see a radical change in civil-military relations, or for that matter, the military ethics or ethos in that 12-year span. That's not to say that there isn't going to be some incremental change. And I think much of this is going to be driven by technology and especially social media. The fact is that even officers who try to keep their footprint, their digital footprint small, who doesn't have a Facebook page here? Yeah, This is much, I don't have one either. I can't tell students I don't want to be their friend, even though I don't want to be their friend. In academia, you have to kind of convey a different issue, presentation. But even if you try to do that, there's going to be so much else out there on the web that almost every individual is going to be subject to being mined by big data analytics. And so what we're going to see in the future is that the public, and especially including subordinates, will know a lot about their leaders, and to include the less attractive aspects that are intrinsic to every human. I think young officers coming up are going to find out that their subordinates are going to look at they're going to find that high school posting that maybe isn't the greatest thing for a company commander, but their subordinates are going to dig that out and find it. So, but in a way, showing an individual's humanness is a positive, and that will help leaders relate to others. But I would suggest that subordinates, especially those under the extreme stress of combat, don't necessarily want to think of their leaders as they do themselves with all the human weaknesses. But rather, I think they want to believe their leaders are something of a superior being that will keep them alive and accomplish the mission. So we're going to have to figure out how to do that when the subordinates are going to have a great deal of information about you, no matter what you try to do. You know, and just as an aside, I wouldn't cast aside the traditional leadership notions too quickly, simply because we have these new technologies. We've been hearing a lot about artificial intelligence and so forth, but here's what I believe. You know what the next big thing is? The next big thing is technologies to disrupt artificial intelligence and those sorts of capabilities. It's just like with drones. Remember, drones were the big thing? Now the big thing is how you disrupt and destroy drones. So we're going to see that with our artificial intelligence. So don't throw away your compasses. They'll still be valuable. I think we'll also see that technology, to include especially neuroscience and biological technologies, will begin to enable enhancements that will include behavioral enhancements. And they might operate to improve leadership qualities and perhaps even make an individual more charismatic than they might be naturally. At the same time, I think there's going to be analytical systems that will be able to reverse engineer what this biologically altered human being is, to find out what they truly are. And I think that we need to keep in mind that these technologies of soldier enhancement are also going to be available to the public. And so what we may be seeing in the future is that as these technologies migrate to publics, we're going to see societal changes. And on my blog, which is called Lawfire, there's a briefing or a presentation by Professor Nita Farahani. She's a neuroscientist. And it is absolutely mind-boggling what she's talking about and things that DARPA is doing. Because what we're talking about is using drugs to increase cognitive capabilities, human-machine interfaces. And so what we're talking about is not only in the future are the adversaries that you may be potentially facing be different from those that you see today, because they could be biologically enhanced or machine-brain interface, but the society to which you relate, our society, could also be very different. Maybe not in 12 years, but in the foreseeable future. One of the things that science will also do, has the capability of doing, is even altering DNA to optimize the breeding of human beings. Now, I can see this happening with soldiers, but it may be in other areas to include politics. There may be some genes and so forth that will optimize somebody for that kind of task. And that will be a very different way of relating and thinking about our professional ethos and certainly civil-military relations, I would suggest. So I do think that the fundamental ethos of the military, you know, the altruism, the dedication, and so forth, that'll remain unchanged. But I think that the understanding of how we relate to society will change, and that'll affect civil-military relations. And part of the problem that we're seeing today is that everything is politicized. If you go up on the Hill to testify about the budget in what you're hoping to be is a very nonpartisan, apolitical way, it's going to be politicized. I thought it was interesting that the New York Times a couple of years ago, I remember there was some testimony on the Hill about the defense budget. It was put on in the politics section. That's the world that we're living in. It's impossible, I think, for officers to think that they can speak out on any subject and think it's not going to be politicized. Therefore, one of the things that I suggest that you do is you're going to have to war game everything you speak or write publicly with the idea that somebody is going to take it out of context and try to give it a political spin. It won't be 100%, you won't 100% be able to protect yourself or to maintain that nonpartisanship, but at least you'll go into it eyes open. And you're going to have to learn the art of advocacy and especially how to leverage social media. We've had other speakers talk about this, but it really is something that you're going to have to do because I think it's going to be a necessary element of leadership and as well as relating to the public. But here's one of the things I'm concerned about. Because so much will exist electronically, everything you think and say, meetings you go to, there'll be a digital representation of it. One of the reasons, by the way, when I teach my classes at Duke, I never allow them to be videoed. I told them, hey, you can videotape me because I'm accountable, but I'm not going to have a student videotape because suppose if I've encouraged her to say something controversial in class and then 20 years from now, she's trying to get confirmed to be Secretary of Defense, somebody's going to dig that thing up and play it out to her adverse, at making her situation more adverse. But I think the fact of the matter is everything is going to be digitized and available. What is this going to do to the candor that we need inside the military establishment, like in an after-action report, when we know that inevitably it's going to get out? I think we're seeing the end of privacy. I think we're seeing the end of classification. I don't think we're going to have secret material. Everything that is digitized, we have to assume it's been compromised. I remember many years ago when I was in War College or Intermediate Service School, General Gray came to talk to us, and it was just when information operations were getting off the ground, and everybody was talking about, seeing the whole battlefield. He said, don't forget that when you play chess, you see everything that your opponent is doing, and you don't always win. So you have to remember the fundamentals of warfighting. It's not all about information, but at the same time, we're going to be living in an era when you're going to go out to the NTC, you're going to come back, you're going to give that feedback to your troops that they need, but that's going to be digitized, it's going to be tweeted out, it's going to get out in some way. So what is that going to do? How is that going to chill what you need to do as a commander? Because I think it's going to inhibit the candor, and we're going to have to work our way through that in order to have the right relationships with not only subordinates, but with the public at large. Because things that you may say to your troops, when we have a public which is not all that familiar with the military, when they hear that, it's going to be mail that you have to answer, so to speak. So I think we're going to have to rethink how we give that kind of feedback. Military leaders very often, rightly, try to represent themselves as nonpartisan. They will even announce that they don't vote because they want to be nonpartisan. Here's the problem with that. big data and analytics are going to sweep in everything about you, and they are going to brand you. They are going to brand you in one way or another, whether that's the brand you think is appropriate or that's the brand that you want to project about yourself. That's part of the world of the future. And when we look at things like Cambridge Analytics, maybe these capabilities already exist. So this brings us to how, or even if, serving officers should speak out on national security matters. I've already said that you should war game. We can get into this more in the Q&A because I have some tactical ideas for you on how you do that successfully. But I think that notwithstanding those challenges, for the foreseeable future, the military is still going to be the most revered entity in American society as it is now. I'm not 100% sure that's always a good thing for democracy, but I think it's going to be the reality, and I'm happy to get into that on the Q&A. You know, one of the things I hear a lot is that, well, you know, the public doesn't know the military, ergo, if they really knew them, they wouldn't like them. There are people who are writing that, but that's not my experience. Anecdotally speaking, when people who've never met anybody in the military actually meet somebody, myself excluded, but if it's a young troop, they come away 10 times more impressed because they see how sharp these young people, they're polite, they're, you know, by and large, I know we have exceptions that prove the rule. So I don't, some of them are sitting here, but by and large, I think that this is going to be sustained at least through the next 12 years. And what's remarkable to me is that the public still feels that this way despite this avalanche of negative publicity in the media. Notwithstanding that, in December of 2017, last December, Gallup did a poll of honesty and ethics in the professions. Military officers were number 2 to guess who? Nurses. That's pretty good company to be in terms of honesty and ethics, despite, think of all the negative publicity that's been about military officers in the past year. Now, why is it? And I don't want to get too political now, but I would invite your attention to a New York Times op-ed by a guy named Ross Duhay, where he talked about, he said, you know, the U.S. won a great victory over ISIS, but nobody seems to notice. And he said, he explained, he had a number of reasons for that. But one of the things he said, it's also a press failure, a case where the media is not adequately reporting an important success because it does not fit into the narrative of Trumpian disaster in which our journalistic entities are all invested. Let's take it out of the, I think that that's going to be more and more in the future. I think journalism is moving away, and not just, let's forget about the current administration, moving away from being this nonpartisan purveyor of information. That's a 3-beer conversation, but that's going to be the future. So military officers, the military is going to have to tell its own story. And that's part of what I mean by saying you're going to have to master social media and so forth in order to tell that story. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the role of retired officers and especially retired general officers. And received wisdom of a lot of the pundits was retired officers should not only not be seen, they should not be heard. And you might remember in early 2017, all these pundits were saying the world, you know, democracy was in jeopardy, the republic is about to go down the drain. Why? Because a military officer, Jim Mattis, was going to be Secretary of Defense. I don't think too many people are saying that right now. And what's interesting about that is there is a specific law which prohibits a retired officer from being Secretary of Defense without a waiver. What I find interesting about that is there's no law that says a child molester can't be Secretary of Defense. There's no law that says someone convicted of treason can't be a Secretary of Defense, but retired military, yeah, there is a law that prohibits that. I think it's very ill-considered. We should have a robust confirmation process, but we shouldn't eliminate a whole category of people. And are there limits as to what retired officers ought to be doing? Yeah. Personally, I don't think retired officers ought to be endorsing partisan candidates. I recognize reasonable minds can differ on that, but that's my personal policy. Something else I personally don't do is I don't sign these group letters from generals. And I'll tell you why. Number one, I think there's something unseemly and a little troubling about retired generals organizing themselves into some kind of letter-writing cabal. Hey, listen, here's what I think. You got something to say it, put your name on it, and stand up and say it yourself. Don't try to hide in the 100 people. And oh, by the way, it's kind of fun to look through those listings of the officers who signed that. And then here's the question I ask. What are they doing now? What conflicts may they have in what they signed? Do you remember those officers who signed that letter saying, don't cut the budget for the State Department? How many of them do you think are on boards and so forth that are related to contractors, related to foreign assistance? That's a question you ought to ask yourself. But in any event, I don't think that we should have a professional ethos that says that we should never hear anything from retired officers, because my experience has been, and I'd like to see some data that tells me I'm wrong, most people, the public, know the difference between an active duty and retired officer. I can certainly tell you in my own experience that's the case. But we can't complain about the public not knowing about anything about the military if the experts aren't allowed, people with some expertise aren't allowed to speak to them out of some misguided, I would suggest, notion of professionalism. The people want to hear that expertise, and that's why I think people like Lieutenant General Hertling are doing a public service. Because if they don't get the information from a retired officer or someone else with similar expertise, they'll find somebody to talk about it. And it may be some masters in political science who may or may not know what they're doing. But in any event, I'm afraid I've gone over my time, and I look forward to the questions. And in one last point on that, on retired officers, don't think that even if we have a professional ethic that or some other means of silencing them, don't think that they're not going to have views. And in democracy, ask yourself this: don't you want them out in the public where their ideas are being scrutinized and examined? Or do you want them working behind the scenes to work their agendas? Here's some words for you. Beware the silence of the generals. And finally, just to reiterate, I think that we're going to see an evolution. I don't think we're going to see radical change in the next 12 years, but especially as science starts changing human beings, we may have to start rethinking how we relate to our subordinates and to the public at large. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I'm putting my political science master's degree back in my wallet now. So, Dr. Shanks, Kaurin.
Good morning, and thank you to Steve for being crazy enough to invite me to come here. I'm a philosopher, so I am here for your assumptions. I'm here to muck with them and ask you questions about things that seem perfectly obvious to you. So as a philosopher, I might ask questions like, what is strategic leadership? Is it really a thing? If it is a thing, is it a thing as opposed to other kinds of things? Is it distinctive? I know. This is what philosophers do. That's why Socrates got executed. And right now you're all thinking, well, if she'd been listening yesterday during Chuck Allen's talk, she would know what strategic leadership is, right? I'm picking on Chuck because he's an old friend. I want to open with those questions because I'm going to sort of come back to them by way of two other questions that Steve has posed for us. One is a question of what do we think military-civilian relations will look like by 2030? And then I'll also talk about the ethos a little bit. So I'm going to respectfully disagree on a couple things, but also agree. So in terms of civilian-military context, you should be asking, what am I looking at? What is my evidence for the claims I'm about to make? And my evidence is my undergraduate students, my ROTC cadets that I teach, and my teenage children. So that's what I'm looking at, and here's what I see, and I'll be happy to hear you all disagree with me. I'm seeing that the relationship with technology is going to continue to evolve. For my teenagers and my students, their devices are an extension of themselves. And I think that's going to continue to evolve. Exactly how, I'm not sure. I think on the civilian side, there will continue to be and perhaps have an increase of risk aversion and an attachment to a comfortable life. I see this with my students. The notion of sacrifice is something that is challenging for them and very foreign to them. And they think it's a wonderful thing that some people like y'all want to do it, but they're like, no, I don't want to do that. There's a very strong, particularly in my students, deference and willingness to defer to military judgment in all things related to war, even ethics, which as an ethicist I find disturbing, and I've pushed back with them on. I think that might also then be paired with a little bit of what was mentioned before. I think we do have increasing political engagement by some active duty military through social media. I'm not sure if that will continue, but it's an interesting phenomenon, whatever you think of it. So my question is the apolitical military, is that still going to be a thing, or do we need to shoot for nonpartisan as opposed to apolitical? I think civilians want to be seen as Americans as doing good. They want to see our country as doing good and being seen in that way. So I think that will continue to inform the kinds of pressures for interventions that you might see. I also think the entertainment environment is really important. Everything almost is entertainment. And my children are able to put in their headphones, listen to whatever music they want to, surf their social media, stream whatever movies they want to. We can all create these sort of environments that are oriented around entertainment, but I think entertainment then conditions our ideas of reality, of what we think is realistic. And it also gives I think the problem of the short attention span, especially from the civilian point of view, is only going to get worse. I think that need for immediate gratification is going to be an issue. Connected to that, I don't know what's going to happen to the common good. I see a sense of common good emerging in some places and being eroded in others. So is there going to be some kind of collective sense of a common good, or is it really going to be about what I as an individual need and want? Two things I'm not sure of. I'm not sure about the politicization, the tribalism that we see in politics, if that's going to remain the same or get worse. I expect it'll remain the same. I don't know that it'll get better. And then I'm biased as a philosopher. I think we're in the midst of an epistemological crisis, which is a fancy way of saying we're having debates over who are legitimate authorities and what is truth. I don't think we're in a post-truth phase, but I think we're having debates about what truth is, if there is such a thing, and what the evidence is, and what evidence you're going to believe. And that's related to the individualism. I have my own sources of information. I'm inclined to believe those sources of information. I'm disinclined to believe sources of information that don't confirm my biases. So that's what I see in terms of the civilian context. The second piece is what's the ethos in 2030? And what I'd ask you to consider, and I've argued this in other work, I'd ask you to consider that we might be moving more towards a guardian ethos and less towards a warfighter, warrior ethos, although that will still be a part of the guardian ethos. You don't have to like that, and you can push back on that if you want. In order to sort of illustrate, though, what I have in mind, I have a list of virtues, but before I get to the virtues, I want to tell you a story. And I'm not going to tell you who the story is about, but you all can probably guess. So I'm reading up for my new job, and I ran across an interesting narrative of a leader that I think most of you would think of as a tactical leader, as a good tactical leader. But when I was reading his narrative, what really struck me was I thought this was strategic leadership, and an interesting take or a different model of strategic leadership. So you can tell me what you think about that. So the gentleman in question is violently, I guess you'd say, thrust into a new situation, although it wasn't a situation that was impossible to anticipate, with only moments to prepare for his new situation. But his study of philosophy and Stoicism had, in a way, prepared him for what was about to happen. He has to cast a new strategic vision, articulate and support a set of organizational values, gather his team, set priorities, engage in care. I'm going to talk about the ethics of care in a little bit, amidst a regular cycle of crises and challenges, against an adversary. And finally, he does what I consider really thinking outside of the box. He literally breaks the conditions of his own circumstance, not sure what will happen, but outside events have also now conspired with his action such that his radical action leads to success in the mission. Right? So as you're thinking about that story, I want you to think about the different components. And one of the things that he was able to do was use discernment to decide what was in his control and not in his control. And that's how he framed what he was going to do. Anyone know who I'm talking about? Yes. Obvious, because I'm reading up on the guy for the job. Yeah, it's Stockdale. So, and I don't think you would think of him as a strategic leader, but here's why I think he's a strategic leader. He exhibited professional discretion and judgment. So to go back to Major Kavanaugh's talk yesterday, I think that's important. I would add discretion to judgment. I think you need both. He engaged in ethics of care. And ethics of care is not about feeling. It is about relationship, and it is about understanding you have ethical obligations to people in a particular context because of the relationship you have with them. I don't always feel like walking my dog at 8 in the morning, but I have a relationship with Rye. There's a context there, and so we're going for a walk even if I don't feel like it, right? He's a lovely dog. Empathy and moral imagination. Stockdale is able to enter into the sentiments not only of his own people, but to try to get into the head of the adversary as well, which is extremely important. Vulnerability. Both physical and emotional is part of his experience, and he talks about that. Authenticity. It was important to him to be true to his training, to his study of philosophy, and particularly he's influenced by the Stoics. Go read Epictetus right now, please. He embraces risk and failure. All kinds of things go wrong and happen in the course of his command or his leading this group of prisoners and trying to hold people together. He's humble, including intellectual humility, which I think is one of the most important traits for a strategic leader to have. I know y'all are brilliant, but you also have to understand that there are things you don't know, and to be curious and humble. He engages in collaboration, teamwork, and this is a word you may not like, dependence. He's dependent on other people, as are the people he's taking care of. He's also flexible and adaptive in some circumstances, and he also is resistant in other circumstances. And so I think part of it is, when are you flexible and adaptive, and when are you resistant? So what I want you to think about in closing, in terms of this list of virtues that I just gave you, which I know are nothing like what is in any of the other documents, but I'm asking you to think about, are there virtues on that list that you think might be important as we move towards 2030? And also to think about and to perhaps rethink what military expertise, both technical and ethical, might look like as we're moving towards 2030. I think the environment will change to some degree. I think the core of the ethos probably won't change, but are there virtues that we need to think about, think about things in a different way? And I think the Stockdale story, for me, was really striking and instructive as a different way to think about it. So thank you.
Dr. Pfaff?
Okay. I too thought I'd talk about technology today, but what I'm going to focus on are some of the ethical issues that surround the acquisition and employment of these technologies. Specifically, I'm going to talk briefly about cyber, lethal autonomous weapon systems, and human enhancements, which I think are coming, which is General Dunlap noted are coming. So beginning with cyberspace, which is our fifth and newest domain of war, it functions very differently from the physical world where the other four domains take place. Unlike in the physical realm, when an attack that constitutes an act of war is typically violent, instrumental, and political, cyber attacks, which are directed at information, don't have to be. In fact, the vast majority of cyber attacks experienced are better characterized, rather than as attacks, as subversion, espionage, or sabotage, which can occur outside of war. That doesn't mean we're safe. Even though it is unlikely we will experience some sort of massive cyber Pearl Harbor, we still may find ourselves in something like a cyber war, where, because cyber technology enables attacks that, while they may be virtual and nonviolent, they can cumulatively be quite destructive and malevolent, resulting in a death by 1,000 cuts through means such as interference in trade and commerce, finance, medical care, transportation, and so on. Now, to the extent a cyber attack results in a physical harm to a person or property, it will likely constitute a use of force, and if severe enough, an armed attack under international law. However, when no violence is associated with an attack, even though it may be disruptive, the rules are not entirely clear what a permissible response would be. If an adversary attacks our civilian infrastructure, are we permitted to attack theirs back? Norms associated with warfighting would suggest not. If we're not permitted to respond in kind, may we respond with military force to stop the attack? Again, I don't think the norms are entirely clear. Now, what these two concerns suggest, though, is a moral premium on defense. If a successful defense eliminates or significantly reduces the harm, it also reduces any injustice to which to respond. But despite this premium, such defense brings in other concerns associated perhaps with surveillance that violates privacy rights, incidentally damaging one's own systems, or severing connections necessary for other critical military and civilian functions. However, defenses can fail, so an emphasis on defense doesn't make these concerns go away. Moreover, exacerbating these concerns is the fact that attacks are not always attributed. Even when we know where an attack is coming from, or at least where the servers are located, we may not know who's responsible. In such cases, we have to have an idea about what sort of actions would be permissible in self-defense. Cyber means also opens up ethical questions regarding actions not normally permitted in the laws of war. Because cyber means can avoid physical harm while attaining a great deal of disruption and possibly coercion, some argue that they are morally preferable. Should we then rethink preventive war doctrine and permit preemptive or preventive operations against an adversary, even if a physical attack is not imminent? Cyber operations also complicate the application of traditional just war principles of discrimination and proportionality. Military and civilian networks are often indistinguishable, and activity aimed at disrupting one could have similar effects on the other. In fact, at a SideCon conference, the Microsoft lawyer there made the point that what one state actor might claim is a justified act of defense, Microsoft might claim is a violation of the terms of use agreement, no matter how discriminated it is. How would you like to be working on that? Now, regarding proportionality, it's not clear how to commensurately weigh virtual harms against physical ones? How many lives is a few hours of a bank being offline worth? The answer is probably none. But what happens when it lasts days and weeks and affects entire banking systems and risk-wrecking economies? In 2014, NATO ministers agreed that a cyber attack could trigger Article 5 mutual defense provisions of the NATO treaty. However, so far, these NATO ministers have been relatively quiet about what scale of cyber attack would trigger mutual defense or what their response would be. I'm going to move on to lethal autonomous weapon systems, because they also pose some interesting problems and some interesting opportunities. And it's a problem that I think folks have mentioned a few times, and made the point that we can't wish it away. China has vowed to be the world's leader in AI by 2030, so they are going to have these systems. Meanwhile, our best AI development centers have ethical concerns over developing this technology for the military. To move forward, we are going to have to address those concerns. Now, one reason for this ethical challenge, I think, is the central role moral autonomy plays in how we assign moral praise and blame. Exercising moral autonomy doesn't simply mean following the rules. It also means deciding which rules one follows. In the words of AI theorist John Hoagland, it means giving a damn. This understanding of autonomy is not exactly the same one articulated in DoD Directive 3000.09, covers autonomous weapon systems, which defines one as a weapon system that, once activated, can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. Such machines apply the rules they are given without much concern for the rules themselves. The directive recognizes, of course, that there are degrees of autonomy here. Roughly, these degrees can be expressed, and I think we've talked about it a little bit over the last 2 days, but human in the loop, human on the loop, and humans out of the loop. In the first two, a human is still technically the decision maker. So I don't think the concerns are here so much about moral responsibility. Rather, it is the impact placing a human in or on the loop has on taking advantage of the system's full capabilities. For example, by the time a human has comprehended the targeting information a system might have provided, the machine could have already acted. When that target is a fast-moving projectile, that extra time could be the difference between life and death. However, when we if we go the other way and take full advantage of the system's capabilities, we introduce an accountability gap. Machines follow the rules humans provide them, at least so far. So if a machine breaks the rules, who then is responsible? The human operator who launched it, the programmer who provided the rules, or the acquisition program manager who determined the requirements? Given all the uncertainties surrounding all these aspects of system acquisition and employment, it's going to be very difficult to answer these questions in advance. There's also moral hazards associated with employing these systems. From a psychological perspective, as these machines distance soldiers from actual fighting and its associated risks, one risks desensitizing soldiers to the harm their machines commit. As one Air Force lieutenant reportedly said about conducting unmanned airstrikes in Iraq, it's like a video game. The ability to kill was like freaking cool. And in that case, a human was on the loop. Imagine how desensitized we might become if we're off the loop altogether. Now, balancing that concern, however, is the positive moral effect these systems can have on warfighting. The precision that even semi-autonomous weapons afford give humans the ability to target more specifically and thus more humanely. Further, because such weapons limit risk, they allow soldiers to act more deliberately, spending more time taking into account factors that are morally relevant to targeting that they might not have done in the heat of battle when human senses, and thus human autonomy, are often compromised. Further, machines are immune to the kinds of motivations that give rise to war crimes, such as revenge, dehumanization, frustration, or even psychological dispositions that make one prone to cruelty. These points suggest that calls to eliminate or strictly reduce the employment of such weapons are off base. Done right, the development and employment of such weapons can better deter war, or failing that, reduce the harms caused by war. Done wrong, however, these same weapons can encourage militaristic responses when other nonviolent alternatives are available, resulting in atrocities for which no one is accountable, and desensitizing soldiers to the killing they do. Speaking of soldiers, let's talk about what we can do to them over the next several years. As General Dunlap noted, technology in this regard is moving along at pace. Now, this effort's not new. Soldiers have long sought to enhance their ability to destroy the enemy and survive. But what is new is the kinds of things medical technology can do to help. We can now alter the human body and mind in ways that increase capacities well above the normal range or provide entirely new ones. At the same time, however, these enhancements often have side effects that are poorly understood and may cause permanent harm to the soldier, even when the enhancement itself is temporary. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, I'm just referring to enhancements as any medical or biological intervention to the body intended to improve a capability or provide one that not otherwise exist. Now, in this regard, the first concern is that the potential life-saving benefits coupled with the potential life-altering side effects, place commanders who would offer such enhancements, as well as the soldiers who would receive them, in a moral bind. Forcing soldiers to accept enhancements that could have debilitating side effects is the definition of exploitation. Allowing them to volunteer, however, is not much better. Making soldiers choose between death and suffering is a form of coercion. Depending on the chances for each, the only rational choice typically would be, well, I'll take suffering. Thus, simply offering an enhancement in a military context can compromise the would-be recipient's autonomy. Now, in providing the enhancement, however, it's not enough just to consider the health and safety of the individual who receives it, but also the health and safety of those who do not, as the latter are less capable than their enhanced comrades of handling the rigors of combat and thus surviving. There are also issues of fairness and equity. This differential in capability introduces additional inequities as the military crafts policies regarding how enhanced and non-enhanced soldiers are treated. Might seem unfair to provide some soldiers enhancement while denying it to others. But to the extent those enhancements make the soldier more lethal, they also make it more likely the enhanced soldiers will see combat and thus be exposed to more risk. Thus, in military context, the inequality and the harm can accrue to the enhanced rather than to the non-enhanced. So what matters here may not be who gets it to receive an enhancement as much as who must receive an enhancement. Finally, enhancements, like all the other technologies I've discussed here, affect how society regards and rewards military service. Society rewards its soldiers precisely because they expose themselves to risks and hardships. However, to the extent soldiers employ enhancements or these other risk-reducing technologies that control fear or eliminate its cause, such rewards will seem misplaced. If one does not experience fear, it makes no sense to reward one for displays of courage. While enhancing soldier survivability and lethality always makes moral sense, enhancing it to the point of near invulnerability, or even just the perception, will profoundly alter the warrior identity and how the warrior fits into society. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something we should be prepared for so it doesn't become one. The final thing I want to just point out about this is it's not enough to address these questions in isolation. We have to take them together, because together they're driving a much less lethal, less risky, but no less disruptive and demanding way of war. It's going to impact what counts as expert knowledge. It's going to impact the kinds of risks and hardships and sacrifice soldiers are required to make. It's going to cause us to question, what does fighting mean when either we're doing it remotely, giving it over to robots, or using nonviolent means. I think those changes, so certainly such changes will provoke considerable review, of the rules of international conflict. Equally certain, such changes are going to have a profound effect on how we run the military, what kinds of capabilities we acquire, who we recruit, how we train and employ them, and how we compensate and reward them. Those changes, as well, will require considerable review of the norms that govern them so that military retains its professional status and continues to serve the society it defends and serve it well. And that's it. Thanks.
I'll move up here so I can see. So it's your turn now. Issues, questions?
Hey, good morning. My name is Matt Humphrey. I'm with the Marines here. First, thank you for your time. This question revolves around what General Dunlap presented. I don't think it was contentious or contended, though. A couple of threads. First, the idea that we're at the end of privacy, that technology is making everything on record. You know, what that does, you mentioned chilling of free speech or just guarded behavior. Prior to that, you talked about the human failures that all of us are subject to. Those include outbursts. Those include things we'd all prefer not be on the record, obviously. Yesterday, we heard one of the panelists talk about selfish leadership, you know, a me leader instead of a we leader. My sense is what you're talking about is guiding us towards the end of the spectrum where we develop people who are really, really good at hiding their intentions. And if they're bad, we kind of fall victim to those after the fact, right? When we recognize them too late. I'm wondering if you see a way around that or if you disagree with that perception. Thanks.
I think that's a great question. Here's the good news, bad news. There aren't that many people who are going to be very, very good at hiding things. I think we're finding that out. There are people who thought that they were very good at hiding things, and they really aren't. Here's where I think the next 12 years is going to be important, because what we're still living in a world where people get hyperventilating about finding out about a weakness of an individual. That's still the cultural ethos, so to speak. 12 years from now or 20 years from now, it's going to be different, because everybody is going to, all of that's going to be exposed. Young people are growing up knowing, what was somebody put on their Facebook page as a freshman in high school. It's just this interim period where I think that that's going to be very, very problematic. I do think it's different. For example, say I wrote something about the Army and I sent it to you. And you might say, hey, Charlie, interesting idea, but here's the way I read it, and here's the way people are going to hear. And I might go, oh my God, I didn't mean that. But now, if I feel that that communication is going to be on the front page of the Washington Post or something like that, I'm not even going to attempt to do that, or I might be chilled from doing that. And the problem is, in this country, our strength comes from our intellectual entrepreneurial spirit. This idea of throwing out ideas and bouncing them off of people, that's the way we get our great ideas. Once we feel that we can't do that or are inhibited in some way, we're going to suffer. So I think here's the analog solution: face-to-face conversation. That's one way that you might be able to control, the dialogue. I also think, and this is one of my nutty theories, is I think that neuroscience in the future is going to tell us that there's a different level of communication because of the electrical activity in the mind when people are proximate to each other. And so I think that there will be something of a retro move to have more face-to-face conversations for sensitive material. I also think we can even see it now. How many people send emails? A lot of people, you'll hear lawyers tell you, hey, make a phone call, because things are going to be taken out of context, and phone call might be recorded, but at least you have a better shot there. So I do think that part of the answer is awareness of the implications of that technology. If you become aware that, hey, I'm not even bouncing ideas off of people, then at least you know that, then you can start working your other kinds of contexts to make sure you preserve that intellectual entrepreneurialism. I do think that people are going to be much more careful about their communications because they know they're going to be exposed. I used to tell commanders that, hey, you guys need to build a macro that says, Bob, sounds like a great idea, but run it by the lawyers, because in this command, we do everything by the book, or something like that. Because I can tell you, when the investigation happens, that complicates the targeting solution for the people going after you. Hey, he said everything is by the book. He told them to run it by the lawyers. No, I think that those kinds of things we will learn how to communicate better, but it's this interim period which is going to be very hard. And I do think, I hate to say this, but officers and leaders, civilian leaders, are going to have to control their brand. And their brand is going to be framed by everything they do. And you have to operate on the presumption that everything you do is going to be compromised, in the sense of if it exists electronically. So thinking about the brand and the brand how you want to be perceived, particularly by subordinates, is going to be very, very important. And the public.
If either other two of you want to comment on it?
No, I think the brand thing is huge, and my students have a sense of what their brand is and what they're trying to portray. So I think that's sort of I'm a little shocked that so many people don't have Facebook. I'm not even going to ask about Twitter, but I think that's a transition that there's different ways to use it. But I mean, I think that there's a transition there that I think eventually will have to happen. Y'all are going to have to get comfy with it.
Can-
So,
Can I do a reattack on that? It's not just you that you have to prepare your families.
yeah.
And I'll tell you why. Here's what the enemy is going to do. They're going to crunch the data. They're going to get your spouse's or your mother's email, and they are going to send a customized email to that family member along this line. We know that your daughter is here in Afghanistan. We are going to kill her tomorrow unless you go out and protest the war. And if you think I'm just having a wild imagination, I would invite your attention. There's the Danish Defense Academy did a monograph on the weaponization of social media, where that actually happened. Something similar happened to some Danish soldiers who were stationed in Afghanistan. So it's not just about how you relate to the public and to your soldiers. You also have to prepare your families for what they may be subjected to, because I think what they're going to do is the enemy is going to go after your financial status while you're deployed, so that when your spouse goes to use her credit card or his credit card, it's not going to work because they want to distract you in your forward deployed location. This is another part of technology. I don't blame people for not having Facebook pages, even though, as I recognize, it's hard to communicate with family members. And so I think it's hard for a parent not to have a Facebook page.
Yeah.
But because you're trying to reduce that footprint, because the enemy is going to be exploiting all of that.
Yep. Yeah, on the branding and Facebook, you know, as many of you may know, a couple of weeks ago, Facebook actually allowed everybody to download all of their data that had ever been put up there because of the Cambridge Analytica thing. So I did mine, and I spent, you know, it was a huge amount of stuff because, you know, I've been there for a long time, basically to communicate with my family. And I went through about an hour of it, and then I said, I am so boring that even I can't stand to go through all of this. But the good part of it was I was like, you know, a for real grown-up adult before I went onto Facebook. So I approached it from the beginning that anything that I put on here, you know, could be made public, could be in the Washington Post or in Chinese intelligence someday. You know, the problem is people that start it when they're 11, 12, 14 years old, and they're not thinking about, well, 30 or 40 years from now, what do I want my
And remember,
brand to be?
an algorithm isn't going to get tired of looking through your stuff.
Yeah.
And
Even it might get bored, though. I can tell you, it was.
There's one other kind of sad part about this is, I think one of the great things about the military is, military allows you to reinvent yourself in a lot of ways. Like you go to a new assignment, you know, maybe your last assignment, there were things that you wish didn't work out. You go to that new assignment, you can kind of reinvent yourself and rebrand yourself. I think that's really going to be hard to do in the future. And that makes me sad, because I think one of the wonderful things about the military is that you can do that. And we've all known those people who were really bad captains who became great colonels. Of course, conversely, you know, that has happened too. The great captains don't always make great colonels. But I think that's another thing.
Yeah, one issue that came up in a unified quest that I was involved with a couple of years ago was somebody pointed out that all of the recruits of the future are already going to have this virtual identity and brand. So is that going to actually factor into our recruiting? Or are we going to look at someone and say, you know, he or she kind of passes the physical and stuff like that, but they've got this virtual brand that they've created over the last 5 or 6 years that might make them susceptible to pressure, blackmail, or whatever, so therefore they're not recruitable? So you have a lot of implications like that. Let me turn to a question from the virtual audience. This was actually from SSI professor Nate Fryer. It might seem strange to you that he's posing a question virtually, but Nate is someone who's currently working remotely, so he sent his question into us. And this is for Dr. Shanks Kaurin. He says, there are strong, often ahistorical or institutional military biases that can cloud civil military trust. How do military institutions break down bias in strategic leaders, and when should they start?
I'm assuming that since Nate's not here, I can't ask him, that the question is that the bias is coming from the military towards the civilian.
That's, you know, that's
That's
the
how
way
I'm-
I'm reading is the
that's how
military
I'm
kind of
reading.
has, you know, has a bias against the civilian political system or
Right.
civilian leaders. So how can military strategic leaders kind of look inward and kind of readjust themselves to work beyond that?
Yes. It's a great question. I am tempted to say I haven't the foggiest idea. I think there's a couple of things. One, every strategic leader was a civilian at one point, so it's not like you were born into the military, although for some people it may feel like it. I was a military brat, so I think some of it is about drawing on those experiences, having a sense of you know, getting perspective from family and friends, maintaining, and I think this can be hard when you're in the military, maintaining networks with people who are intentional networks outside the military. This is where, you know, social media can be useful. I also do think it is useful, and maybe it's you all will think it's too much of a burden. I think the burden goes both ways. I do think if you're in the military, you know that there's a sort of bias, and you're going to have to cultivate relationships and be aware and reflect on that bias and think about, and there may be good reasons for that bias, but then if I know in a committee meeting that I'm inclined to be blunt, then I know when I'm meeting with my president, I need to overcorrect the other way because I know I have this tendency. So I think that can be useful. I also do think there is some civilian responsibility here as well. And I think to the degree that we can have more civilian education about an interaction with the military, might that then start to break down some of those biases a little bit? I'm not sure. I think so, because I teach a course at PLU for civilian honors students called The Experience of War, and once they're done with that course, I think they have a much better understanding and framework from which to think about the military. And I also teach military ethics, and half of the students in that course are civilians. I think those kinds of interaction, especially in the military ethics course, then the ROTC students, who are technically still sort of civilians, right, are having conversations with the civilian students. I think those kinds of formative experiences are important. So I wouldn't want to wait. I'm not sure what our threshold for, like, when you become a strategic leader is. I'm still confused about that. Is there like a coronation? You are now a strategic leader? Like, do you get a pin?
Yeah, there's a big ceremony with the snipe hunt.
What happens, right? But I would like to see that something that is throughout a military member's career, that this is a conscious thing that's cultivated from the very beginning.
Yep. Sir, over here.
Ryan Gunn, Seminar 4, Army Officer, Military Intelligence. I wanted to circle back around to something that General Dunlap mentioned, which was the idea that you have a macro that pushes information back to, hey, run this by the JAG. And I think we've all had experience where leadership wants the JAG's review. And we talked about yesterday about artificial intelligence and the increasing role of artificial intelligence. And I think there's this not too long-term distant vision of where artificial intelligence is going to be guiding the decision points of leaders. They're going to be looking to it for courses of action and operational approaches. And one of the questions I have, and we talked about in a seminar yesterday, is will that be constraining as leaders are put into positions where they're getting advice from an AI that's built in with organizational biases and the textbook answer to problems or courses of action based on the certain context. And so they're going to be put into a position where they can either default to what the machine is telling them, which is probably the safe answer, or go with their judgment. We talked yesterday also about the need for critical thinking and innovation and character in making these decisions. Do we run the risk of having, and so my question is, do we run the risk of having AI kind of be this homogenizing effect on strategic leaders in the way they make decisions, because their natural inclination is going to be to default to what the machine's telling them, because then if the decision goes wrong, they can say, hey, well, this was the textbook answer, and this is what we're supposed to do by the book, so to speak. And so I think that's true, and I just wonder if we see that broadening out with the expansion of AI into decision making.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and my answer would be something I talked about in the seminar I was in. A couple parts of that. Number one, I think every senior leader who's effective has a good idea of what he or she doesn't know. So if there's one piece of advice I would give to people, know what you don't know. And with respect to AI, well, and with respect, I'll talk about JAGS in a second, but with respect to AI, know what it doesn't know. So in other words, as these systems come online, it will be incumbent upon you not to understand all the detail and the logarithms, but have an understanding of what the capability is. And when we get to machine learning AI, it's going to have to be very carefully tested and scenario run. We'll have to have testing protocols where you have machine learning AI that's testing the machine learning AI in that way. But here's Dunlap's theory, based on my almost 35 years working with commanders on active duty. There are things that are resident in the mind of the commander who has the burden of command that can't be articulated, can't be quantified, and do not transfer once you go out of command. It's only when you have that burden of command and the responsibilities for mission success and caring for your people. I can't articulate what it is, but I've seen it over and over and over again, and it's different. So at the end of the day, it's more important for you to trust your own judgment. And I'll give you a real world example. What AI system would have told General MacArthur that the Incheon landings were a good idea? Zero. Yet we know that obviously it was a very successful stratagem. So I think that there is still a place for the human who is able to assemble in a very unique way facts, emotions, and everything else for the successful decision. Now, what does that mean when it is wrong? How do you, well, you're going to, what I tell commanders is you're going to be tried in a court, maybe not a judicial court, but the court of public opinion. So what I recommend is record your rationale to the extent you can when you're making one of these controversial decisions. And a JAG might help you do that, but here's the thing about JAGs these days. It is super hard to get into the US military as a military lawyer these days. It's about an 8 to 10% selection rate. So you're going to get a very smart young man or woman who knows the law. But what you're going to have to do is make sure they know your business. And I mean down to the details. They have to, if you're a helicopter battalion, they're going to need to know everything about helicopters, the weapons, the strategy, the tactics, and everything else. And if they're not willing to invest themselves in that level of knowledge, you got to fire them. You got to get somebody else, just like you would fire a logistician or an intel officer or whoever who isn't investing in your mission and your command, because that's what you have to do. And if you don't have somebody like that, they're never going to give you good advice, because they're going to be coming from the abstract, and then the machine will tell, the human machine will tell no. I once had some people from from DARPA that, hey, we think we can replace JAGs in the CAOC, and because we're going to put the whole Geneva Conventions into this machine learning thing. You know what the problem with that is? If you know how it works, it will say, well, 80, as they go through the rules, it will always come up with no. Because the default, as it goes through the rules, the default's going to be no. So it will never, you'll never strike anything. which raises its own moral issues. One of the things that gets me in academia is they say, well, you know, if they don't do these strikes, look at all the civilians will be saved. As if killing a guy with a drone strike, when you don't do that for whatever reason, sometimes there are good reasons, that guy is going to go out and do some really horrific things to a lot of innocent civilians. So don't think it's a cost-free decision if you get to zero and get to no. You haven't necessarily done a good thing. You've jeopardized people who have no way of defending themselves.
Either you, other two want to comment on this? Yeah, Tony?
Yeah, no, I just want to kind of amplify with the, and give a, example some of you may be familiar with. In Iraq, we used to run a software program that chose routes. One day, someone went on a route that was selected, and they immediately got hit. What happened? Because that was the most dangerous route, the machine had not selected for it over and over and over again, to the point there was no data of any incidents on that route. So so they went on because they did. And this is why I want to amplify General Dunlap's point, is that you have to know how that machine works, and that was one of the things I was thinking about when you talk about how that's going to impact the kind of expert knowledge we're going to be looking for senior leaders to have. But then the other side to this, though, is that you're never going, these are complex adaptive systems operating in complex adaptive systems. You're never going to have full knowledge. So you're going to have to do the odd thing of asking yourself, do I trust the machine? And how is trusting the machine like trusting a person? Particularly when that machine gets so sophisticated, it becomes different to tell the truth. Is that a different moral problem, or is that the same moral problem? Because if I didn't have that machine selecting routes, I would have had some lieutenant selecting those routes, and that lieutenant may or may not have made the same mistake. So I think that's going to be the kind of environment where that you'll be seeing someday. I would point out, when again underscore General Dunlap's point about 2030 is not that far away. We gave the contract for the F-35 to Lockheed in 2001. So the stuff that we're thinking about now is probably what's going to be available when the time comes.
I'm a little skeptical too about how quickly. We have to think of these systems as decision support systems, not decision replacement systems. And I am a little bit skeptical about how they will get down to the tactical level, how you'll keep this machine working under, austere conditions and so forth. So someday in the future, maybe, but maybe not. I remember I was in New York not long ago, and I went to the 1960, not long ago, I saw the big spear from the 1964 World's Fair that I attended as a teenager. And I remember thinking all the things that were right around the corner that were predicted in 1964. We were all going to be in flying cars by 1990, and it didn't happen. So this adaptation will happen. There will be things that will be much quicker than others, but I do think that I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to see a Terminator on the battlefield in our lifetime for a million different reasons.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think a lot of people in this room are going to have to figure out the Goldilocks principle on decision support mechanisms, because if you totally reject it, push back against it, you're going to get left behind. But as our panelists have indicated here, to unthinkingly and unjudgmentally embrace it would be just as dangerous as well. So the problem is going to be to find that sweet spot where you use this as it can be used, but you don't become totally reliant on it.
Good morning. My name is Colonel Chip O'Neill. Thank you all for being here today. Ma'am, I have a question for you. As you were talking to us earlier, you mentioned the shrinking attention deficit that we have in the United States, but then you listed 12 virtues, about 12 or so. And as a philosopher, I would ask you, do you think that, in 2030 or even beyond, the cardinal virtues, there's only 4 of them that came from the ancient Greece. Do you think they're losing resonance, or are you just expounding on those? What do you think?
That's a great question. And yeah, it is a long list of virtues, but I think the virtues go together. I believe in the unity of the virtues, so you could clump some of those together if you like. I don't know if the virtues are changing, or if the list I gave you is a different way to articulate those virtues, in a relational and a contextual way. Because I think part of what we're going to be seeing is that I see this with my students. When we do the classical ethical theories like Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, it's interesting, they talk about it, they're like, okay, you know, and they can work with it. But when we get to the ethics of care, for them, that's the one that makes sense to them because it fits with their lived experience of experiencing ethical dilemmas and ethical problems in a context and within a network of relationships. So it may just be that it's what I'm doing is taking that classical view and thinking about our current context. I mean, do I think courage, for example, is still going to be an important virtue? Yeah, and I think when I'm talking about authenticity, right? Moral courage is involved in that. So it may be that, or vulnerability, it takes courage to be vulnerable, to say to someone, I don't know the right answer. Or I can't do this thing because I have some kind of physical issues, as Stockdale did. So maybe what you want to take is the classical view, and is there a way to think about them in a different way? Because if I say the 4 cardinal virtues to my teenagers, right, like they're going to roll their heads back and, you know, so is some of it a translation issue of saying, here's what connects with my students. And it's not, I don't think of it as dumbing down. When I gave the example about my dog earlier, that's a serious ethical obligation, right? I need to take the dog for a walk, right? But it's an ethical obligation in the context of my relationship and the commitments that I've made with that dog. If one of my students shows up in my house at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm not going for a walk with them. Because that's not part of the context of our relationship. And so I'm positing that, is that a helpful way for you all to start to think about strategic leadership in a slightly different way, right? Are there 1 or 2 virtues on that list that resonate for you? I can tell you for my students, authenticity is at the top of the list. Like that is the most important virtue to them beyond everything else, right? It is about authenticity for them.
I think that's very true, and it does remind me of something that we were talking about earlier, how we can relate better to the civilian community. In my Law of Armed Conflict class at Duke, there are 2 Special Forces officers, current Special Forces officers who are in a program, so they don't have to move to Carlisle. They get to go to Duke. And they were magnificent in closing that gap because these are fairly senior guys. They weren't spring butts, but they added authenticity to everything we talked about. And what was interesting, and what most civilians have been acculturated to thinking of the military by entertainment.
Right.
So one of the reasons a lot of these kids don't want to join is they think, holy cow, because all they see is special forces and SEALs and all that kind of stuff. They think, well, I can't do that. Yeah. They don't even have any. I meet so many students who are shocked to know that there are lawyers in uniform in the military. They don't even know that. We're sending 9 from Duke in the last 2 years, which is a lot from a quote, elite law school. None of them came to law school with any idea of going into the military. They had no background because they didn't even know that there would be a place for them. And so I do think that there is something to be said when we can integrate at least a small piece of this into civilian universities, because there's no better representative to the United States Army or the U.S. Armed Forces in general than those 2 Special Forces guys. And they did a briefing on an operation they did in Iraq, and it was just magnificent. It's hard to, to grow that, to do that in size, but I think it's a small step, especially if we want to penetrate these areas where there is no military presence. You know, Secretary Cates came to Duke in 2010. He said, the Army is going to be concentrated in 5 states. And he's right. And it used to be we could count on the Guard to be the kind of, but see, the Guard is like the Army. I mean, it's like the professional military now. It's not that focused on, you know, the community, at least my sense, and I stand to be corrected on that. So we have to look for more innovative ways.
And Pauline, I have to say, I greatly admire that your dog will let you go to 8 a.m. because I'm convinced that my recently departed 95-pound Doberman could tell time, and at 6:30 he said, "I've done due diligence." So
It's all about
eight sounds nice.
habituation. So
Yeah,
it didn't
yeah.
start out at 8.
Hi, Colonel Frawley. This question's for Dr. Pfaff. This will sound overly wonkish, but it's only because of the painful minefield I had to walk through my required SRP that I had to get through this stuff. So you spoke about the importance of cyber defense, but also focused on the challenges with cyber offense. In terms of deterrence, there are two primary approaches: deterrence by denial, as represented by cyber defense, and deterrence by punishment. But if we focus on the challenges of deterrence by punishment, then effectively we self-deter within the cyber domain. So in terms of deterring cross-domain or multi-domain coercion, are we at the risk of ceding the cyber domain, or are we simply looking at a policy of cross-domain deterrence?
That's a great question. First of all, I think that it's really just as simple as we should just, flood the Chinese with cat videos and be done with it, and shut down their system that way. In fact, we've been trying that for a while now with some success. If I understand your question, yeah. So, because one of the problems with the cyber tool is you use it, you lose it. So when you talk, and so a lot of the thinking on this, there's a premium on defense, because it's like one of those things where if you're going to engage in cyber activity, you're going to be on the network, you kind of have an obligation to take some defensive steps. Otherwise, it's like drinking from a polluted stream, knowing that it's polluted, knowing that you could simply take a couple of simple measures like boiling the water and avoid the harm. You won't bother to do that, and then you want to sue the company for polluting the stream. You might have some kind of case, but their lawyers are going to go after you for not taking simple precautions. And there is some negligence and moral fault on your own. So that suggests that the defense is kind of an obligation here. But then I think your point is okay, so it makes it really hard when you're going on the offensive. It's okay, now all of a sudden I'm going to lose that asset. Right, so that's why I think your point about cross-domain deterrence, I think, is an important one we have to think about, particularly as all sorts of other things, particularly non-lethal measures not associated with cyber, are becoming, are becoming available that we can use in order to whether it's an economic sanction, whether it is some kind of political restriction or a political sanction, removing someone from an international organization. There's all sorts of things that we can do that are non-lethal that we'll have to think about. Now, the hard one, of course, is, all right, the only way I can get this to stop is to use some sort of lethal action. And I would also argue you also have legal recourse, and that's something also to think about in this cross-domain piece. Is maybe we need to do more to start work on the international enforcement of some of these things. But having said that, ultimately that's a problem we're going to have. At what point am I able to cross over into uses of force or threats of force? And until that cyber activity crosses a threshold where it is really impacting civilians' ability to meet basic needs and really disruptive of civil life, you're probably not going to cross that threshold. Does that more or less answer your question?
Let me dive into that a little bit. I think that Tony's kind of correctly put the law out there as it is, but I think we should remember that China has not even accepted that the law of armed conflict even applies to cyber. There's a great monograph by a guy named Julian Q. I think it's AEI has it, where he discusses that in some detail. So where we are now in this country is norm development. Yeah. There are things, for example, the Sony hack, they fried computers. That has the, quote, destruction that you would look for when you're trying to decide if something's an analog to an armed attack. We don't want to call it that way. So until we are willing to designate these activities as attacks within the meaning of law and develop the norms, we're going to continue to be in this muddled era. Now, but here's the other side of it is we want to be very careful about what we decide is an attack, because we may have capabilities that we think are superior. This is the general problem with cyber. Every little country, hey, they think, hey, we got a computer. We can take down New York City or Moscow or whatever it is. And so that's why norm development is going so slowly. And I think that in the United States, we need to sit down and have a hard discussion with ourselves and decide when do we want to start calling these things, and then we got to call them. And then that will help the norms develop, because you won't have deterrence if you call something to be just a trivial event. Then the adversary is not going to be deterred, because they're going to say, oh, the Sony thing is just defacing. Okay, then that means the United States thinks that's okay. So we can do that. And they might, indict one of our people, but we don't care about that. So until we start deciding on that, and we don't want that decision point to be when the banking system goes down. So I think we need to do some norm building.
I'm going to grab the last question myself, because that actually touches on two of our panelists. Dr. Shanks, Kaurin, you, in your comments, you speculated on the possibility of transitioning from a warfighter ethos to a guardian ethos. Okay. As you said that, the thing going through my mind, since I'm a political scientist who's done lots of work with comparative politics, is that history suggests that nations that have that military ethos sometimes suffer military coups.
Yeah.
That's where we tie into our other panelists, because as you may or may not know, one of General Dunlap's early claims to fame was writing a dystopian future article where there had been a failed military coup attempt in the United States. And he kind of laid out trends he saw at the time that led to this, hypothetical.
Successful. The coup was successful.
Oh, was it successful? Okay.
Yeah.
I remember the guy was in prison, but it has been a long time since I've read it. So anyhow, so the question is, do you see a risk or danger from switching from a very carefully delimited warfighter ethos to the broader guardian ethos?
That's a good question. I think there could be a danger. Part of why, and y'all can go read my book to sort this out. Part of what I'm thinking about there is just that there will be other tasks. There are other tasks that the military is engaged in, other than what we think of as strict war fighting. And also that the idea of a guardian might make it easier to incorporate things like ethics of care and humanitarian interventions, those kinds of things. But I think, the question of the coup, always a tricky one. I got in trouble with my article in Newsweek earlier this year talking about this topic. But I mean, in general, I think the likelihood is fairly low, but if the switch in ethos continues or increases the insularity or a sense of we know what's best for our society, that kind of thing, then I think that there is a danger, because I do see this deference to political or to military judgment with my students. Their view is, I don't know whether we should go into Syria or not. We should just let the military decide, right? There may be a bit of a danger there.
I think there is virtually zero possibility of an actual military coup as we would, classically understand that. I think that there is some danger of over-representation of the military perspective in various areas. But what I'm most concerned about is diluting military expertise, energy, and focus away from traditional warfighting. We need to have some entity in our society, whatever the 1% or 7.75% of our population, devoted to one thing, and that's fighting and winning the nation's wars when necessary. So when we dilute into other kinds of activities that other people ought to be doing, we draw away from that focus and our energy. So that 0.75% that's serving in the armed forces needs to be that war-fighting piece. What I found most interesting about your presentation, and I think is really dynamic, is that we might be moving from an apolitical ideal to a nonpartisan ideal, and I think you're absolutely right, because everything's been politicized.
Right.
So it's going to be political, but let's keep it with a small p, and try to keep it nonpartisan.
Tony, do you want to weigh in on this? You don't have to.
I think there's literally no chance of a coup happening anytime soon. But I take your point, and because it's certainly consequence of the stuff I'm talking about. Who right now does most of the information operations in public diplomacy, or information operations for the United States government? Well, it's the military. Who does all the, where does all that, whole of government, planning actually occur? Where does that document, happen? It's probably in a military document someplace. Done by a military planner who's working with other agencies. And so I take your point. At some point, we've got to make a decision as we bring it, as things like controlling the narrative and the stuff you were talking about, and branding and media operations, and all that becomes more and more important. Meanwhile, we have to understand and incorporate the economic impact of what we're doing, not only to ourselves, but also to the adversaries we're trying to address, and we're trying to work on these other things. We're going to have, if that's going to either become a much bigger part of the things you're going to have to make decisions about, or we're going to need someone else who has that kind of expertise and expert knowledge to do that with us.
Great, thanks. We go into a break now, so please be back in your seats at 11:30 for the closing address, and please help me thank our panelists.